Let me begin by emphasizing the role of the individual leader, Israeli Prime Minister, US President, because it's relevant to all the questions that you raised before. For instance, you asked about Israel turning, going to the right. I think that the important element in Israeli politics is the large floating bloc in the middle. In the 90s, it had already been true that, let's say, the Labour Party as such could not win an election in Israel. That if the Labour Party was headed by a Rabin or by Ehud Barak, that is to say, a centrist security or Mr. National Security type, that person could swing the Israeli vote. I think that remains true today. Netanyahu now is in a commanding position, but a leader cast in the mold of Rabin or Barak could swing that floating center, and things could change. In that regard, the change is not as dramatic as it would seem. What has happened in early 2009 was that, call it the quote-unquote left-wing US President was elected and a right-wing Israeli Prime Minister was elected. Martin used before the term train wreck, and one could see a train wreck happening, because if you look at the position that Barack Obama came with into the White House and the position that Bibi Netanyahu came with into the Prime Minister's post, there was a train wreck in the making. And unfortunately, the personal relationship that developed or failed to develop between the two of them tended to exacerbate the issue. Now, same thing with regard to what is happening in the region. What is happening in the region could go in any number of directions. On the whole, there's more tendency toward democracy, towards populist views, and of course Israel has done well dealing with autocratic rulers. It is not necessarily the case that Israel should do worse with more popular government. It is more difficult. But much depends on statecraft, on diplomacy, what Israel does with the situation. Look at some positive developments from Israel's point of view. The weakening of the regime in Syria has weakened the Iranian axis, that is Iran's foreign policy. Syria, Hamas rushed to Gaza to sign the agreement, to Cairo to sign the agreement with the Palestinian Authority because it felt weakened. Turkey is just shifting its policy vis-à-vis Syria, vis-à-vis the idea of sending the Avi Marmara yet again to Gaza, and say a creative Israeli foreign policy that looks at the region, looks at the anxieties of countries like Saudi Arabia, can actually accomplish quite a lot with creative diplomacy. So what is happening is not necessarily to Israel's disadvantage. Let me spend a couple of minutes speaking about Obama and Netanyahu, since I emphasized the personal element. And let me introduce into the discussion the term linkage that has not been raised so far. Netanyahu came into office, Obama came into office having used the linkage theory during the campaign. The linkage theory is the theory that says that almost everything in the region is linked to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that by supporting Israel generally and in its conflict with the Palestinians, the United States is harming its own position, makes it more difficult for Arab allies to cooperate with the United States, and more difficult for the United States to wage wars in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. This theory was articulated most fully by General David Petraeus in March 2010 when he testified for Congress. This really doesn't make any sense. That once the United States invaded Iraq and invaded Afghanistan and encounters resistance, to say that it's more difficult for the United States to manage its affairs in Iraq and Afghanistan because of the Palestinian issue, to me doesn't make sense. But it is a significant fact that a major figure like David Petraeus would say that. There are two possibilities. One is that he believes that to say that the notion percolated into the professional ranks of the senior military, American military, is worrisome from an Israeli point of view. The other possibility is that he was making the bidding of the White House, saying that because he knew that this is what the President and the White House would like him to say. That's, again, not very encouraging. But if you go back into Obama during the campaign, let's say his interview with Tom Brokaw, which I reread the other day on MSNBC, he said that himself during the campaign. But that's a very negative development. I think that Obama, the candidate, and Obama, the president, has also drawn a very sharp distinction between a commitment to Israel's security and a position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what the US needs to do in that regard that is very, very different. He's been very consistent in that regard, including in his last speeches. Speaking of the last speeches, I'd also like to emphasize two other elements in what President Obama said, both in the State Department speech or in the AIPAC speech. One is when he defined the relationship, he spoke about community of values, not a community of interests. What we need to see in order to bolster that relationship is a complementarity between values and interest. And a US president that emphasizes the commitment and the shared values, but not the shared interest, is not positive. Secondly, the president laid it plainly on the table, the domestic dimension of the issues. He said in the AIPAC speech that he knows that it's not common for a US president seeking re-election to deal with controversial issues. He was speaking about exactly what was happening those days when the Prime Minister of Israel came to Washington at the invitation of the Republican speaker in order to address the joint session, looking at the next presidential election. So he just called a spade in that regard, but the issue is there and in an awkward fashion. Last words on call it the base for support for Israel. In the past few years, I've been spending quite a bit of time teaching on US campuses. I don't like what I see. And Israel is much more controversial, in some circles illegitimate, in the general student community and the faculty, and among Jewish faculty and students. When we look at Obama, we cannot ignore the fact that part of it comes from his age and the period when he went to school and where he went to school. That's part of his formation. And when I look down the road, 10 or 20 years, at presidents and secretaries of state and generals who are going to school today on American campuses, I'm worried. Thank you.